quite excited to see if my slides have been possessed as well. Particularly because I did get excited and put lots of animations in here, so it's either going to be very good or very bad. Yes, that's the title of my presentation, and I'd just like to also acknowledge that Murdoch University, where I'm at, is also on the land of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. In 2011, the University of Western Australia opened its Centre for Sleep Science. It was opened by Alan Robson, who was the Vice-Chancellor at that time, and many of you may know that Alan unfortunately passed away last week, but he was an absolute... this was one of the last things he did with his discretionary account, was give me the money to put this 5-bed centre together which can do full sleep studies. And it was run by a combination of respiratory physicians from Sir Charles Gairdner Hospital and sleep physiologists and scientists. So Jem Walsh, Kath Madison are still running the Centre for Sleep Science today. And the beauty about it was that we could do full polysomnography, poly being many, somno being sleep, and ography meaning measurements. So lots of sleep measurements in people who came through there. And it was the clinical standard and still is. In 2014, the RAIN study was actually based at what was then called Telethon Institute for Child Health Research, now Telethon Kids Institute. And so that's where it was then. And then in 2014, we moved it. So Leon Straker and I took over the directorship of the RAIN in about 2012, 13, and realised that, the participants were no longer children, and perhaps it wasn't the right fit in the Child's Institute. So we managed to find a position on the University of Western Australia's campus and move them across to the building we're in right now. And that's a really nice picture of some of the key team members there. So that's where it is, and it's in this beautiful southern part of the UWA campus, very close to the cafe down by the river. And if you have a close-up, that's what it looks like now. When we first moved in there, we only had half of the RAIN building because there was a genetic epidemiology group there. We got rid of them pretty quickly and took over the entire building, which is what it is now. But from my point of view, the really exciting bit was it was right across the road, or not literally next door, to the Centre for Sleep Science. And that meant that we could do the full sleep studies, plus all the other measurements that RAIN was known for, including accelerometry, which Leon Straker and Joe McVeigh have been doing for a long time in the RAIN study, a whole bunch of questionnaires, measures of cognitive function, pain. David Hilmer and I managed to get a DEXA scanner from Richard Prince in endocrinology, which we nicked off him, and we had it up in the Sir Charles Gairdner Hospital, and we moved it from there into the RAIN study building. So we also had DEXA scans, which is full-body scans of both fat and bone mass, which we did in the 22-year-old participants, cardiometabolic measure, vascular eyes, and biological samples. So we had this mechanism to do something really interesting between sleep and longitudinal data. We put an NHMRC project grant application in, which was successful, and to determine the prevalence of sleep apnea, to characterise its clinical features, and start looking at some of the predictors based on trajectories. And to me, this was the key slide that got us the grant. And if ever you're trying to put a grant application in, always have something really telling cartoon of some kind on the front page. This is on our front page. And what it showed is all the prevalence studies about sleep apnea across the whole world at that time, based on age. Age on the bottom, and the study is along the y-axis. And you can see that if you look down the middle there, there's a complete gap at around 22 years old. There's no data to speak of about the prevalence of sleep apnea in young adults. That red blob is what RAIN study could do. It could fill in that gap. So that was the most telling part of the argument, together with the existing RAIN data, which this is a histogram of the BMI profile at the 20-year follow-up, just showing that at that time, 21% of the RAIN participants were overweight and 14% obese. And given that BMI is the biggest risk factor for sleep apnea, and they are exactly the same as the then Australian prevalences, we made an argument that we're going to have a population which is representative of the Australian population at that age. So we put in 2 more grants over the years, which were funded. One was looking at craniofacial function, structure and its relationship to sleep apnea, and the other being the Gen 1 participants. We had the data on Gen 2. Now we wanted to have a look at the parents and start looking at some hereditary components of the relationship between sleep disorders across the two generations. And of course, we all know how hard it is to fund these follow-ups. So there was a whole bunch of other grants, which I'm not talking about, but they were across cardiovascular, eyes, spinal pain, asthma, physical activity, sedentary behaviour, work productivity, all different grants which combine together to allow us to do those big follow-ups. They're very expensive. And of course, this was taken only a week ago from the RAIN website, just showing that in terms of sleep, we have data from questionnaires across from infancy all the way through childhood, all the way through adolescence. And then we have the more intensive sleep studies done when they were 22. And of course, when the Gen 2 were 26, we also did the parents for the sleep studies. So we've got an enormous data set to work with. In other words, we've got lots of cross-sectional data, lots of longitudinal data. It's multidisciplinary, multi-generational, and without exception, the data has been collected at a research standard because it was primarily going to be used for research. So what do we do with it in terms of sleep? Well, this is probably a really important graph because it shows the retention rates over the years of the RAIN study participants. The dotted line being those that were eligible, and of course there's a decline there for people who have died, lost the follow-up, have chosen not to continue participating, and the solid line is just the number that were actually studied at each of those follow-ups. The gap at, I think, the second year was due to funding being lost partway through the study. But you can see that the younger adults, they tended to have, we're starting to get a drop off there. So we have to acknowledge that the representativeness of the sample may not be similar. And so there's been lots of studies out to look at that exactly. This is from Scott White, showing that there was no evidence of a selection bias for the outcome exposure measures when they were 22 years old or 20 years old. There's a really nice cohort profile from Leon Straker, which describes all the measurements that we made of the cohort when they were 22 years old. And there was cohort protocols have been published, so people can refer to these papers and look at exactly how it was done, who it was done, and why it was done. And this is also, in parallel, David Mackey from Lion's Eye has done follow-ups, 7, 8 year follow-up. So this one was done when they were 26 years old. That's also been published. And of course, most recently, we've done a protocol paper based on the generation ones, the parents. So anyone can go back and look at all this information and find out exactly how the data were collected. Accelerometers, I mentioned, in the 22-year-olds, we had an accelerometer on the wrist and on the hip. And as I say, Leon had been doing that for years. And it gave us lots of opportunities to look at different aspects of behaviour, including sedentary time, physical activity, including some of the behavioural, psychological, socio-demographic correlates of physical activity, including the validity of some of the automated algorithms which we get given in the black boxes that accompany these accelerometers and how they behaved. And to summarise those few published papers, what we showed was that young adults do spend a lot of their day sedentary, and that the periods of sedentary behaviour are prolonged, that there was higher moderate to vigorous physical activity in women who lived with a partner, but men slept better. There you go. and based on hip actigraphy, we developed an automated algorithm which was quite good for detecting physical activity and sleep, but really was not good at detecting when someone was in bed awake. So that's always a challenge for every kind of actigraph, even the Apple Watches that you all use. So the other thing we could do is, because we had simultaneous actigraphy and polysomnography, we could see how well does these things actually measure sleep. So the first thing we did was a study with some mathematicians to align the actigraphy and the polysomnography, publish that. Another thing we did was compare laboratory and home-based actigraphy for measuring sleep with the gold standard polysomnography study. Another thing we did was estimated sleep duration. All actigraphy devices claim to measure this, but we used an open source method to have a look and see how accurate that was. And we also took it one step further and said, not only do we want to measure the sleep duration and whether you're awake or asleep, we want to measure whether we can determine the different stages of sleep, non-REM and REM sleep, using these devices. And also, this is the most recent study published with both Oxford University and the University in Seoul, looking at the use of the accelerometry data in the UK Biobank, and I'll talk about it in a sec. So summarise these, we developed an algorithm to align actigraphy with the sleep studies. We showed that sleep latency, so the time you take to fall asleep, sleep efficiency, the number of times you're awake versus asleep at night, and sleep wake after onset are not measured that accurately with actigraphy. Couldn't make it work very well. And sleep duration tended to be overestimated regardless of what algorithm you used. And non-REM sleep was easily detected, but rapid eye movement sleep was very hard to be detected with actigraphy. And then we collaborated with the people from Oxford, and they used deep learning to develop a new algorithm in 1,100 of our participants and applied them to the UK Biobank, which has about 65,000 participants, and published that in one of the Nature journals, and showed yes, we could use the algorithm quite well, but also that there was a relationship between increased risk of all-cause mortality and shorter sleep time in a very large population. We could also look at the prevalence of sleep disorders in the 22-year-olds and also in their parents. And Nigel McArdle produced these really nice kind of infographics just showing the number of participants, females and males, in the 22-year-olds who had different kinds of sleep disorders. Did the same thing in the parents. And bottom line is that these are the prevalences of two of the most common sleep disorders, sleep apnea and insomnia, in the young adults, females and males, and the middle-aged females and males, their parents, that is. And you can see that insomnia is more common in females than males, and that sleep apnea is more common in males than females. But look at the increase in prevalence from young adults to middle-aged adults. 47% of men had sleep apnea, which is a great concern. We also did three-dimensional facial scans, and this was a device that we got from an orthodontist. I was having some work done, and I said, "Well, what's that?" And he said it was a device that they use for orthodontic surgery, and he didn't use it very much, so he gave it to us. So we used that, and we scanned all of the participants. And this is me when I was much younger, having this done, and it's an amazing device. It takes the photograph in 3 dimensions, and it processes this is all in real time, processes, and it produces a scary photograph like that, and you can spin it round, and then it'll convert it into a grayscale. But behind that is hundreds of thousands of X, Y, Z coordinates, so you can make it extremely quantitative. And we produced some papers looking at the relationship between the facial measurements from there and 3-dimensional face photography. The orthodontists were very interested in, when they do face reconstructions, what is the symmetry of a normal 22-year-old's face? And also we did some work with some evolutionary biologists who are looking at the structure of the face, or the masculinity, femininity of the face. And so this was used quite broadly, but it was interesting that just by looking at the face and making measurements of it, both linear, point to point, and across the geodesic across the surfaces, that we could classify someone with or without sleep apnea at 91%. And for the orthodontists, 50% of faces in young adults were asymmetrical by about 2 millimeters, and that there was a relationship between immune function in when you were young and what your face looks like in terms of degree of masculinity and femininity when you're older. The other unique thing about the RAIN data is that when the participants are 22, we've got, for the first time, really interesting data about the workplace. And so we published a few papers about multimorbidity is 2 or more chronic health conditions, relationship between that and sleep, insomnia in the workplace, looked at shift work and mental health disorders and sleep disorders. And to summarise that, the highest burden of productivity loss was musculoskeletal problems, but then sleep was second, followed by other mental health and neurological conditions. Productivity loss is greater in those who had a sleep disorder. And perhaps the last one is the most interesting, is this notion of undiagnosed sleep disorders being responsible for a lot of the risk associated with shift work rather than shift work itself, which is what's currently thought. And Trevor's spoken about sleep and cardiovascular function. Kelly's produced a couple of papers on this, and she talked about those earlier. This notion of chronotype, morning, evening person, putting you at different, the risk between having changes in blood pressure if you've got sleep apnea. This is an example of, across the bottom, this time of day, is a time of day. and then you've just got different days on there, and you can see straight away, left-hand side, someone sleeping regularly, starting and finishing regular times, right-hand side, irregular sleep, and there's an interesting relationship between those who sleep irregularly and the odds of having high blood pressure. And finally, one of the really great things about RAIN is that we have lots of data over time. And that first picture of John with the baby, I suspect that Con and Lou may actually know who that baby is, but I'll ask them later. But you can see that over time, they grew up. They're now, that was when they were 22, I think, when the participant was 22. And what that allows us to do is to do trajectories of sleep disorders, which was done to look at behavioural problems in adolescence and also look at health in childhood. And it's interesting because if you look at the top blue one there, it just shows the trajectory of sleep behaviours over time. Then if you do cluster analysis, you can tease out the differences. And you can see there's a group, about 10%, who have persisting sleep problems and those who don't. So you can analyse and you can do different kind of cluster analyses, but you come out with roughly the same categorisations and look at the relationship between persisting sleep problems in childhood longitudinally and other health outcomes later in life. The other thing that the RAIN study has done, it was pretty influential in what was a parliamentary inquiry in Australia a few years ago looking at, it was called bedtime reading, but it was about sleep health and sleep disorders in 2019. And RAIN had a really important role to play here. In fact, we had one of the inquiries was held here in this building. And the pitch we were making to the parliamentarians is that the sleep is really the third pillar of health, along with physical activity and diet. They're supposed to respond to this in Parliament, but of course about 2 weeks after this was presented to Parliament, COVID hit. So it wasn't until 2023 that we had a response from Parliament about that inquiry, and it had 11 recommendations, but the first recommendation is worth reading out, which is the committee recommends that the Australian government prioritise sleep health as a national priority and recognise it's important to health and wellbeing alongside fitness and nutrition. The other recommendations talk about how that kind of prioritisation could be achieved. And finally, globally, because of my role in the RAIN study and because of the papers we published, I was invited to be on a paper in Lancet Respiratory Medicine, which looked at the global prevalence of sleep apnea. Bottom line, 1 billion people across the world have sleep apnea, and you can see that it's probably one of the most cited papers in the field of sleep medicine and continuing to grow. Also, more recently, I've been involved with a paper with the World Sleep Society group, and we produced a paper in Lancet Public Health, which was about the need to promote sleep health in public health agendas across the world. And very recently, we've just signed an agreement with the World Health Organization to help them develop some guidelines around sleep health globally. So RAIN goes well beyond just these walls. It goes national and it goes global. So in summary, what I hope I've showed you is that with what's relatively modest funding for laboratory-based polysomnography studies across multiple generations, add that together with the extensive and deep RAIN data we have in the RAIN study, we can develop a large and growing number of impactful sleep-related manuscripts and also have impacts on policy, including things like parliamentary inquiries in global sleep health. Now, this was just using sleep as what I think is just one example of the huge return on investment that can be achieved by all of us using the RAIN study. So thank you very much.
We have time for questions. So I'm going to ask you a question. I mean, I'm a sleep scientist as well, so I'm a bit biased here. Not shift work expert, shush. He was always badly behaved. What do you think is the next frontier in sleep research for the RAIN study?
I think that the next big thing for sleep is the next big thing for just about everything in the RAIN study, which is using the longitudinal data we have. We've done lots and lots of cross-sectional studies, which have been fantastic, but they're just associations. If you start looking at longitudinal data, you can start looking at cause and effect. And I think, I think John in his video this morning made the point that the value of the RAIN study is just getting more and more and more the longer we keep it going, the more measurements we make. So to me, the longitudinal data, whether it's sleep or respiratory or cardiovascular, and what that can tell us about the origins of disease and what we can do to intervene early and have profound potentially impacts later is where the gold is. Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you. Join me in thanking Peter.